Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 60. The Best of Days. It was warm inside the sleeping bag. So warm in fact that Ruby was almost able to imagine that she was back in her dorm in Beacon, happy with the heating on and cuddled up under the sheets with her girlfriend. Of course, she knew she wasn't at Beacon. She was in the middle of a forest surrounded by deadly grim. But thankfully that was the only thing different from her mental image. She was still cuddled up against her girlfriend, still incredibly warm, and, most importantly of all, happy. Although, that happiness was also joined by a little bit of awkwardness. While there was no doubt that the decision she had made to remove her top last night had been the correct one and had allowed her to finally stop shivering, it had made waking up a little more awkward. Though there had been plenty of awkwardness the night before, she had been far too tired to really take in exactly what such an action would mean, but with rest and a little more energy, she was very aware that they were both practically naked inside the sleeping bag. However, while it was awkward and she was unable to look down due to knowing that she would be treated to a sight that she didn't feel right looking at while Blake was asleep, she was definitely still happy. Resting against her girlfriend's shoulder, her finger lazily tracing a flower pattern on the girl's stomach, listening to the girl's slow breathing, it was all extremely comforting. "That tickles," Blake said, her voice a little groggy as she shifted in her sleep. "Oop. Sorry." She pulled her hand away, only to feel a pair of thin fingers wrap around her wrist and keep it in place. "It's nice though." Looking up, she saw the girl's eyes were still closed, but there was a relaxed smile on her face. Wanting to keep it there, and also wanting an excuse to stay in the tent a little longer, she resumed her previous menstruation. "What time is it?" Blake asked while stifling a yawn. "Just after dawn, I think," Ruby replied, going by the fact that there was only a sliver of light on the tent's back wall. "It sounds like the storm's passed too." Good," Blake hummed. "Then we still have an hour till we have to get up. Or we could help pack up and get ready to go." "Oh." Blake shuffled a little lower in the sleeping bag and twisted so that they were face to face. "We could cuddle in the warmth for a little longer before going out into the cold." Both were appealing options. However, as much as Ruby wanted to help the people in the camp pack up and get ready to move out, she was still extremely low on energy and knew she needed to rest as much as she could. So, making a necessary sacrifice, she opted to stay in the tent and enjoy what little time she could. "All right," she said, cuddling up a little closer to her girlfriend and feeling a leg slip between hers. "You win." "I always do," Blake chuckled. "Unless you have Weiss's back up." "Rude." Ruby pouted playfully and poked the girl in the stomach. "We'll see who wins when we get back. I'm gonna need a promise on that one." Ruby blushed slightly at that implication. "Shush." A happy feeling ran through her as she felt Blake shake from suppressed laughter in her arms. She knew the past week had not exactly been the best for her, but to know she was feeling at least happy enough to joke around made Ruby a lot more hopeful that everything would turn out okay. That was only helped more when Blake's eyes finally opened and Ruby saw that her favorite mischievous glint had returned to them. "I will beat you though." Blake smiled. "You owe me sushi when you don't though. And you owe me cookies when I do. I'm already buying you cookies. You can never have too many cookies. You'll change your tune when your teeth fall out." "Nah," Ruby replied smugly. "I use my aura to protect them. See?" Opening her mouth, she showed off her perfectly white teeth for a second. "Perfect." I couldn't see." Having a point to prove, Ruby did it again. "Sensitivity check." Before she could stop her, Blake blew a short burst of air onto her teeth, causing Ruby to chuckle as she recoiled at the weird feeling. "Huh." She laughed victoriously and stuck out her tongue. "No sensitivity." Feeling her stomach flutter as a chuckle left Blake's lips, Ruby finally stopped drawing the rose patterns on the girl's stomach and let her hand slip around her waist. As if to make up for the lost feeling, Blake's finger began to trace the same pattern on her back instead. Flashing back to a pleasant afternoon in the dorm after some weird brownies, Ruby pulled herself forward and let her head nestle further up on her girlfriend's arm. "All right," Blake hummed. "I'll believe you, for now." "Good." Ruby grinned and pressed a quick kiss into her girlfriend's lips. However, as she pulled away, something about the kiss felt different. She knew for a fact that she had enjoyed every kiss they'd shared in the past, but for some reason, that one had felt better. Even as she laid there looking into the deep pools of amber, and the smile that pulled at the woman's lips, she felt a warm pull in her stomach as what felt like a magnetic field pulled her back into the kiss. She only made it halfway, however, before Blake's lips met hers, and it very quickly became apparent to Ruby that Blake had felt the exact same thing. Unlike the short, innocent kiss that had come before it, the renewed one was anything but. Instead, it was deep and hungry. Every bit of pressure only made Ruby want more, and when Blake's tongue requested entry, she happily gave it. She wasn't sure how long the moment lasted. It could have been hours for all she knew, but however long it was glorious. The way Blake's tongue felt dancing over hers, the way the girl's hand slightly roamed her body, their testing touch sending shivers of pleasure through her. At some point, Ruby had even ended up on top of her girlfriend with no idea how, but she didn't have a single complaint. That was until she heard Weiss' voice outside their tent. "Are you two awake in there?" They both let out a groan. "I will take that as a yes. Your parents said we are moving out early to make up for lost time yesterday." "All right," Blake called back, a slight amount of frustration in her voice. Ruby could sympathize. Though she knew they were on a mission and that it took priority, she couldn't help but be a little frustrated that they'd been interrupted. It had been the first time since Yang and Crow had interrupted them that something of the sort had happened, and she couldn't recall a single part of her that had wanted it to stop. Even as she looked down and saw that her new position had exposed both of their bodies to each other, there was no awkwardness. No desire to cover up as there had been previously. Instead, she was comfortable. "Pretty sure that means we need to get up," Ruby breathed, knowing that there was disappointment in her own voice. "MHM," Blake hummed, but didn't move. "Want me to close my eyes?" Ruby shook her head and pressed another kiss against her girlfriend's lips. Just like before, she felt a strong force attempt to pull her deeper into it, but knew she had to fight it off. "Not if you don't want to," she said with a nervous smile. "I never want to," Blake breathed. Ruby knew it was cheesy, and that Blake had no doubt pulled it from one of her books, but it made her blush all the same. However, as much as she would have loved to kiss her again, she knew that those kisses were now rather dangerous, at least until they got back to Beacon. So, with a great amount of effort, she reached back and pulled Blake's hand from the back of her boxers and rolled off of her to get dressed. Sat on a tree branch looking down at the half-deconstructed camp below, Ruby couldn't help but miss the warmth of her tent. It had been borderline painful to leave the comforting embrace of her girlfriend and get dressed for what would no doubt be another tiring day of walking and fighting. Instead of being stuck in a tree, her clothes already wet from the rain that had clung to the leaves, she wished more than anything that she was back there. Though she was still unsure what would even have happened had they not been interrupted. Would it have ended just like every other one of those moments? A little fondling and nothing more? Or would more have happened? A tent in the middle of nowhere surrounded by Grimm was certainly not how she had ever imagined her first time, but she had also never imagined feeling that at ease. Even thinking back on it, she couldn't say that she hadn't wanted more to happen because she definitely had. "Weiss," she hummed, absent-mindedly flipping the dust canister in her hand. "MMM?" Weiss replied without even looking back, fiddling with the lightning crystal to get it free from the pole. "When did you know you were ready for sex?" There was a small commotion above her, and she looked up to see that Weiss' hand had slipped and broken a branch, causing her to lose her balance. Quickly regaining it, though, she glared down at her. "What on remnant made you think that now was the time to ask such a question?" the heiress blustered. "Sorry," she apologized. "It's just that this morning me and Blake—" "I am fully aware of what you two are doing, Ruby." "What? How?" she blushed. "Because I am neither blind nor deaf," Weiss replied tartly. "Does how I know really matter?" "I guess not." She was a little curious, though. It wasn't like they'd been loud, and they definitely hadn't been visible. Did they smell or something? Pulling her top forward, she gave a quick sniff and quickly recoiled. She definitely didn't smell the best, having spent nearly a week fighting off Grimm without any way to shower. But there was nothing there that could give away what they were doing. "Okay, but—" She shifted on the branch and looked up at her partner. "How did you know?" Apparently sensing that it wasn't a conversation that she was going to get out of, Weiss let out an annoyed breath and shook her head. I didn't, the girl said in a dismissive tone. But it was never that big of a deal for me. Unlike a lot of people, my virginity was not something that ever mattered to me. Ruby was a little taken aback. Though she had certainly not been blind to the nature of Weiss' relationship with Neptune, she had thought that was something more experimental for the girl. In fact, with how proper she was, Ruby had always pegged her as a girl who would have wanted her first time to be the right time and the right place. So when did you? She paused and tapped the canister. You know? A few months before leaving for Beacon, Weiss replied. The boy was a family friend. We were both interested and in the mood, and it happened. Just like that? Yes. Wow. What? Nothing. Ruby paused again, though quickly faltered when a piercing blue eye looked down at her. You just don't seem the type. You're all proper and stuff. Apparently that had not been the right thing to say, as Weiss' eyes narrowed at her. I am proper because that is the respectable way to be. The snow-haired girl scowled. But never for a second believe that I act in such a way for someone else's benefit. I act as I do so that I feel good about myself. Okay, Ruby interrupted. She knew just how long Weiss could go on about propriety. But none of that helps me know if I'm ready. Letting out a sigh and looking down at the camp, she found Blake among the crowd and watched her girlfriend loading things into the cart. While she had definitely felt ready that morning, how did she know she had not just become caught up in the moment? Let me just... She heard Weiss' breath. Got it! Her eyes flicked back up as she felt movement above her to see that Weiss was making her way back down the tree with the dust crystal in hand. Just as Ruby suspected, the normally pale yellow gem was shining, and in the very center was what looked to be a miniature sun that Ruby knew definitely should not be there. There was no doubt that it had taken more than 2 strikes during the night. Canister. Holding the tube out, she unscrewed the top and pulled out the small cage inside that Weiss had prepared the night before. Even as Weiss slowly put it onto the stand, Ruby could hear the crystal humming and crackling, but once the crystal was in place, she quickly snapped the lid back on and silenced it. There. The girl sighed and wiped her brow. Now! Her attention turned upwards with a serious expression. However, Ruby was still able to see the usual glint in Weiss that showed she was trying to be kind. I am going to be honest with you, Ruby. Sex is not special. What? Ruby asked, slightly confused. That's the truth. You will most likely enjoy it, and you will most likely want to do it again and again. But what it will not do is change you. You will not be a different person afterwards. It will not be revolutionary, and that is because sex by itself is not special. It is who you do it with that makes it special. Ruby supposed that was true. While she had imagined it before with previous crushes in passing, those thoughts never even came close to how imagining it with Blake felt. With everyone else, it was merely a thought, but with Blake, she always came away from it with her stomach full of butterflies and her heart aflutter. So if Blake is that person for you, someone who makes you feel safe and comfortable, and a moment arrives where you want it to happen, then go ahead. While it didn't tell her if she was ready or not, Ruby did appreciate the advice. There was no doubt in her mind that Blake was someone she felt safe and comfortable with. Thanks. Ruby smiled at her partner. I'm just nervous. You're fine. Weiss shook her head and stood up on the branch. Just please make sure to give me and Yang fair warning beforehand. I'm pretty sure I speak for the both of us when I say that neither of us want to walk in on that. I will. Ruby nodded, not looking forward to how awkward it would be to tell her team to stay away from the dorm. It was awkward enough when Yang did it. Good. The heiress sighed and looked down at her white skirt that had been tinged green and brown from the wet branches. Now can we please get down from here? The lack of mud had always been something Blake had loved about home. Being a tropical island with only 1/3 of its landmass being able to support life, most of which was sand and rocks, mud and dirt had always been quite the rarity. Of course there were the farms, and the forest at the back of the village was rather dense with vegetation, but those were places that Blake had rarely ventured. And even when she had, they'd been dry. Unfortunately, she wasn't on Menagerie. She was on Sanus. And unlike Menagerie, the continent was full of the disgusting stuff. So much so that after stepping off of Weiss Cliff, Her boot sucked itself ankle-deep into the thick layer of filth that had washed off of the hill in the rainstorm. Pulling it free with a loud squelch, she shook her foot and watched a globule of mud fly through the air and hit her dad in the chest. "Oops, sorry," she grimaced. "Just a bit of mud." The man chuckled and brushed it away, leaving brown smear on his coat. "I'm pretty sure I have more than that on me anyway." Looking down, she saw that he indeed did. While Weiss had been kind enough to extend her glyphs over the small landslide so that they could easily continue along the road without having to find another, she wasn't able to do that for the rest of the journey, especially since she was already focused on keeping the cart's tires from sinking into the ground. As such, pretty much everyone had a large splattering of mud and water on the clothes from heel to knee. "Just a little," she smiled at him. "Oh well." He grinned and reached out a hand to help Mrs. Amaranth avoid the dirt. "Can you smell that, Dottie? The beautiful smell of nature." "That's the smell of wolf shit, young man," the elderly woman grumbled, knocking his hand away with her cane and stepping over it herself, her grandson following her while carefully holding the canister containing the lightning crystal Weiss had used the previous night. "In as good a mood as ever." The man laughed and moved out of her way. "Though I do think she's right." "I hope not." Blake groaned and checked her shoes. Thankfully, it looked to be just mud. "We could do with a storm like this back home," the man hummed to himself. Looking up from her boots, she saw a hint of concern enter her dad's face. While nobody really knew why, rain seemed to avoid Menagerie. There was usually enough for their rivers to keep flowing, but the depth of them was never consistent. Some years the river could be filled to the brim and be enough to dive in, others it would barely come up to chest height. Thankfully, the island had managed to come up with a state-of-the-art water filtration system that kept the farms running and the people hydrated, but that also came with water restrictions on each household. "When did it last rain?" she asked. 3 months ago," he replied and began to walk again. "And we found the northwest part of the forest taken over last month." "Damn," Blake breathed. "I'm guessing that's why you look so tired lately." Though it was understandable why many would view Menagerie as a paradise, the people who lived there knew differently. The lack of rain, the lack of soil, the lack of animals, there were many things about the island that made it hard to live on. But the hardest of all had to be the island itself. Though Kwakwana resided on the 1/3 of the island that was hospitable, it had been done so with the understanding that the village could never really expand due to the desert that covered the rest of the continent. Unlike the desert of Vacuo, which despite being dangerous could be lived in, Menagerie's desert was dead. Nothing grew there. There were no trees, no plants, no animals, not even any cacti. The only thing that could survive it were Grimm. And sadly, that desert was constantly trying to overtake the rest of the island. It was slow, and likely wouldn't happen for hundreds of years, but eventually even the small little haven that Kwakwana resided on would be swallowed whole. "I'm fine," Gyra said, a smile on his face that Blake was almost certain was a lie. "We're coping. The filtration system is holding up, and we've been getting more trade with Vacuo." "And the Grimm?" Just like everything else on Menagerie, the Grimm were also unusual. While most Grimm around the world resembled animals, Blake had never read about any animals that resembled the Grimm back home. The closest she could think of was giant lizards, but even that wasn't right. "Persistent as ever," he admitted, "but the guard is managing to fight them back, and more hunters have been coming to our aid lately." "But?" "It's nothing." She raised an eyebrow. "You learned that look from your mother." She had, and it had always served her well. "Fine," he said with his hands up. "The Titanosaurus has been heard closer to the village." Just its name made Blake shiver. She'd never seen it herself since it always stuck to the desert, but she still remembered its roar. A horrifying, guttural sound that would occasionally rip through the island with enough force to shake the walls of their houses. Every time it sounded, fear followed, and the next night would be spent fending off the Grimm that came running. "That's not nothing, Dad," Blake said, her ears flattening against her head. "It's never attacked the village before," Gyra said with confidence. "It never even leaves the mountains. And if it does, we have tools to drive it away. We may not be many, but we are a nation of fighters and survivors." She couldn't exactly argue with that. War, Grimm, persecution. The people of Menagerie had survived it all. "I suppose that's true." Feeling a strong hand on her shoulder, She looked up to see her dad giving her a reassuring smile. The village has stood strong for almost 100 years, and it will stand strong for hundreds more. If there is one thing we faunists are good at, it is fighting for our right to live. Choosing not to clarify that they should have had to become good at that in the first place, Blake gave the man a small nod. With a touch more force, he squeezed her shoulder before withdrawing his hand, and Blake quickly felt sadness at its loss. It may not have been much, but it was still physical proof that she and her parents were once again together. Beal. The sound of static coming from her earpiece caused her to flinch a little. CEO, me? Ruby? She questioned. Yes. Hi. The call evened out as they came back into range of each other. All clear up here. No more landslides, we're headed back now. All right. I'll let the others know. A few Grimm broke away from us though, Jan added. They were heading your way. I'll keep an ear out. She nodded. See you when you get back. Is everything okay? Yeah. Just telling me the road ahead is clear except for a few Grimm. That's good. Kyra nodded. Though I doubt we will make it to the border today. Blake didn't think they would either, and as if to confirm their doubts, a small rattling sound came from behind them, followed by an all-too-familiar tooting. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw that the cart had slipped off the glyphs, causing two of its wheels to sink into the mound of wet dirt. Next to it stood Weiss, her eyes tired and dangerous as they glared at Prince, who anxiously scratched his head, his sister doing nothing but laughing at him. Me too, she muttered as a group of guards rushed over to the cart to help free it. Any signal? Nope, Ruby sighed. We've got to be like a mile away, at most. Nobody would build a cabin too far into the dead zone. Blake didn't want to correct the girl, as she had seen plenty of cabins in the middle nowhere in her travels. However, she knew this time Ruby was right. While it had definitely seen better days, with its blown-out windows, and its wall full of bullet holes, the small structure they had stumbled upon was still in relatively okay condition. Her best guess was that it was a remnant from the Great War. At the very least, though, it was stable, and just large enough that it made for a great place to hunker down for the night. Well, at least we know we're close, Blake offered, throwing away a piece of broken wood and pulling Ruby onto her lap. I know, the girl mumbled, shifting a little to get comfortable. If that stupid rainstorm hadn't hit yesterday, we might have made it to the village today. We'll make it tomorrow. She wrapped her arms around the girl's waist. Me, and you can even head out early to call for extraction. Or we could go now and have them waiting for us at the border tomorrow. Or we could get some rest and not get lost in the woods in the middle of the night. Ugh. The girl grinned playfully, though Blake sensed some genuine disappointment. Fian. Shaking her head, Blake pulled the girl in closer and pressed a small kiss against the girl's neck, feeling a shiver run through her in response. She had definitely not forgotten about what had happened that morning, and from the way Ruby had been acting around her all day, she could tell the same was true for her too. Ahoy, loverbirds! Flicking an eyes towards the door as it opened, Blake watched as Prince and Peddly walked out of the cabin, the former giving them both a knowing grin. Sorry to interrupt, just going for a slash. A what? He's going for a pee, Blake clarified for her girlfriend. You know there's a toilet inside, right? I know that it don't flush, Prince corrected her. And that Mr. Fern is still pulling splinters out of his as dash a cough came from the younger girl, who was holding her legs close together. Sorry, but anyways, we'll be back in ammo. Don't wander too far, Ruby called after him as he stepped down from the porch. With a wave over his shoulder, the pair disappeared into the tree line where the night guards were patrolling. Glad that they were alone again, Blake resumed her nibbling of her girlfriend's neck, causing the girl to let out an adorable giggle. Are you done yet? Hold your horses. Been walking all day. Ugh, it's cold. Holding her arms around herself, Peddly rubbed her jacket in an attempt to get warm. Sadly, with such an action being common in England, and it having been a few years since Prince had bought her it, the fire dust that had been embedded inside had long since been used up. She wished she could have stayed in the cabin, warm and comfortable while laid up by the fire, but the need to relieve herself had inevitably arrived, and with what Mr. Fern had done before finding out the lever was broken, there was no way she was stepping foot in that toilet. Come on, Prince, she shivered. It's freezing out here, and I feel like I'm being watched. Granted, she felt like that almost every day since leaving England, but at least then it had either been daylight or at camp, not in the middle of the dark, eerily quiet forest. All right, the man chuckled. I'm coming. Chill ya beans. Rolling her eyes at the pet name her brother had given her due to the large amount of freckles that covered her face, she heard him finally begin to move and turned back towards the cabin. Finally, she muttered. However, after only 3 steps towards the building, she heard her brother stop and look back to see why, only to find that he wasn't there. Prince? She called, receiving no reply. What are you doing? Letting out a small groan, she returned to the tree where her brother had been and found nothing. Feeling a little bit of worry and fear rush through her, she quickly dug out her scroll and turned the light on. Prince? She called again, letting the light sweep the area. Where are you? As the light swept across some trees a few meters away, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of her brother walking away from the cabin. A large wave of relief crashed over her, and she began walking towards him. Cabin's this way, genius! She chuckled mockingly, rushing to catch up with him. However, with every step she took towards him, those chuckles quickly began to fade. Something was off. He was walking funny. His body was tilted slightly as if one side was weighed down, and his feet dragged along the floor. His arms hung limply at his sides, jostling slightly with each step, but not truly swinging. Most noticeably was that his head, usually held upright and proud, hung low. Prince? She asked again. He came to a jerky stop, and the hairs on the back of Pedley's neck stood up. Though he didn't reply, he did slowly begin to turn around. As he did, the sudden urge to step back filled her. Remembering what her brother had always told her about trusting those urges, she did. Big bro? She whispered, taking another step back. Raising her torch as his turn finished, she looked into her brother's eyes to find the green that had always twinkled with joy and mischief were gone. Instead, they were empty and hollow, and looked to be straining against their sockets. He took a step forward, and she took one back as bile began to build in her throat. B. He cut himself off, taking another step forward. St. Stop! She stuttered, her shoulder hitting a tree as she backed away more. B. His voice was raspy, as if the word he was trying to say was causing him physical pain. Taking another step backwards, she watched as the previously limp hand groped his leg, landing on the knife that was strapped there. Ple, please St. Stop! She pleaded, hoping it was all a bad dream that she could will away. But it wasn't. She knew it wasn't, and as her brother freed the knife from its sheath, she was forced to watch as the muscles in his face quivered, unable to look away as his lips pulled into a disgusting attempt at a smile. Beans! He finally groaned. Feeling the scream rip from her throat, she fell backwards as he lunged. Chapter 61. The Worst of Days. It had been a nice night. Despite the rainstorm the night before, the chill had once again been replaced with a nice cool breeze that rustled the trees. The sound was nice, and Ruby had been happily enjoying letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over her as she sat against her girlfriend's lap. That was until a loud, agonizing scream ripped through the quiet forest. The moment instantly shattered, and both she and Blake leapt to their feet and jumped down from the porch. Where wa dash? She began to ask Blake, whose ears were already twisting back and forth to locate the direction of the sound. Before she could even finish her question, there was a rustling in the tree line ahead of them, and 2 people came tumbling out. Prince and Pedley, their bright red hair shone under the moonlight as the former hunched over the latter. In his hand was a knife, the gleaming silver metal being brought down in repeated, frantic slashing motions, each one earning a short howl of pain as the young girl tried her best to protect her face with her arms. Desperately trying to crawl away from him, the girl's foot landed in his face and sent him reeling backwards, though he quickly recovered and began to advance again. No! The yell that left her was instinctual, and before she could register any more information her semblance had activated, and she was rushing towards the man. She didn't know what had happened, or why the man would be attacking his little sister, but those answers could come later. All that mattered was making sure the girl was safe. The world turned to a blur, and she covered the small garden in the blink of an eye. However, despite her speed, his eyes locked onto her, and the hand holding the knife shot jerkily towards her chest, causing her to activate her aura to block it. Pain shot through her entire body at the sheer power of the man's strike, and she was forced off course and into a nearby tree. Confused at how he could have reacted so fast, she looked up at him and saw that his usually cheerful eyes were dull and lifeless. A stomach-churning, deformed grin was plastered on his face in a poor imitation of a human smile, blood gently flowing into it from the bit nose that Petali had no doubt broken. "Prince?" She was confused. Why was he attacking his sister? Why had he not used his aura to protect himself? Why did he not even look human anymore? There was only one answer. A Grimm had done something to him. But what Grimm? She didn't know of anything that could do something so vile. She watched in horror as his muscles flexed and his shape contorted to comply with whatever was forcing him to act in such a way. Twisting around to face Blake, who had begun to rush in herself, with such jarring speed that his head was still left facing the other direction for a second, his hand holding the knife pitched backwards before jutting forward to throw the weapon. Once again, Ruby found herself surprised. Just like Prince had with her, he also predicted Blake's movement. At the same time that the shadow formed around her, and she leapt into the air, Prince released the blade and sent it whirling through the air. It hit its mark, clipping her in the shoulder and sending her spinning back to the ground. "What's going on?" Ruby heard a hurried voice call from the cabin, as the door was ripped open to reveal Yang. "It's Prince," she called back, pushing herself to her feet. "Something road dash." "Beans!" The voice cut her off and made Bao rise to her throat. It was unmistakably Prince's, but it was wrong. It sounded painful, as if his vocal cords had been replaced with glass. A spray of saliva and blood billowed out in front of him as the word was uttered, and she could hear the hatred within it. On the floor, the girl scurried away with a terrified look as blood leaked down her arm and face. "Blake, get Petali!" Ruby called, wanting the girl out of the way since she was clearly the one it wanted. "Yen, wait!" Too late. Yang had already slammed her fist forward, releasing one of her shells that screamed towards the man. With his aura down, there was no doubt in her mind that it would be a fatal shot, so jumped in front of him to deflect it. As she did, she felt a heavy fist slam into the back of her head. It was nowhere near as strong as the earlier attack, but there was enough force to send her tumbling forward. "What the hell, Ruby?" Yang called as more people began to leave the cabin to see what was happening. "His aura's down," she replied, springing to her feet and rounding on Prince. The horrible grin was still on his face as he lunged at Petali as Blake moved to grab her. "We have to restrain him." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw some guards emerge from the woods and rush in to help Blake, but just as Ruby was about to join them, a hand closed tightly around her wrist. Feeling herself be spun around, she found herself face to face with her sister. While they were still their usual soft lilac, there was a hardness to them. "There's no point," the girl said with a firm tone, though there was definitely regret there. "He's already gone." "What?" Ruby questioned. "No, he's not. He just needs he dash." "He's a Grimm child," Yang interrupted her. Ruby's eyes widened. She hated that story. Hated the idea of a Grimm that could possess a loved one and make them into monsters. Yang had only ever read it to her once, and it had given her such a bad nightmare that the blonde had immediately removed all traces of it from the house. But she had never once believed they were real. The closest she'd ever had of was geists, but they couldn't even possess dead bodies, let alone living people. "That's a STO dash." "Look at him, Ruby!" Yang demanded. What had been an easy action mere moments ago suddenly felt so much more difficult. Turning her head to look at the man, she saw he was already stumbling. His face was white as paper, and his movements were slower, so much so that he was unable to even block the kick that Blake delivered to his midsection. It was his turn to tumble backward, but unlike Ruby, he didn't get up. Instead, he merely began to drag his way towards his target. The side of his knees scraping deep lines into the muddy ground, and his hand reaching for his sister caused a memory to spark in her head. They have no marks. No scratches, no bites, no puncture wounds, nothing. They're just dead, and always with their hands reaching for the wall. "No," she breathed, realizing that whatever had possessed Prince had been trying to get into Zealand for months. Yang had said that the marks looked like the victims had crawled from the dead zone. "He's gone, Ruby," Yang repeated as Redentia moved towards the downed man and drew his sword. No! She muttered again and watched him raise the curved blade. The blade fell and Ruby twisted her arm free of her sister's grip. No! Ruby! Too late. She already put everything she had into her semblance and boosted off. Petals erupted from her, blanketing the area in a sea of crimson as she charged at Redentia. She reached him just in time. The blade was less than half a meter away from Prince's neck, but being mid-attack and too preoccupied with the threat, Saber didn't notice her until her shoulder slammed into his side, causing him to drop the sword and skid a few meters along the ground, sending rose petals and mud everywhere. She heard the gasp from everyone around her, but ignored it and drew her scythe. Holding it at the ready, she prepared to defend anyone who dared to try and approach the struggling boy. "I won't let you kill him," she declared, kicking the fallen scimitar away. "He's already dead," Saber retorted, pushing himself to his feet and drawing his gun. "Now you're just defending a Grimm." "He's a person," she spat. "He's a chill," Redentia replied and raised his gun. "Now let me finish this." He didn't even flinch as he pulled the trigger, but Ruby spun Crescent Rose with ease and deflected the bullet. All around her, the guard raised their own guns. Behind her, she heard the telltale sound of a glyph being formed, and the sound of scraping mud stopped. Turning her head ever so slightly, she saw that Weiss had produced a black glyph underneath Prince to stop him from going anywhere. Looking was a mistake. The second her eyes left Saber, another shot rang out, quickly followed by 4 more. Thankfully, Blake stepped in and deflected them. "Stop!" Blake ordered, stepping between them with her hands out. "What is it, chill?" "I don't take orders from you." "But you do from me." Gyra's deep voice came from the cabin porch and Saber faltered. "Explain." The man's eyes filled with annoyance. "A possession Grimm. Almost nobody survived Dash." "Almost?" Ruby asked, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. "Then he's a Dash." "Surviving a chill does not mean living," Saber growled angrily. "The chill needs to be extracted within the first minute. If not, the host is rendered brain dead. His legs have already shut down. He's as good as dead. We need to kill it while it's inside of him." "But there's still a chance," she pleaded. She refused to believe there was nothing she could do, that there was no way to save him. "If we just Dash." "Wait for what, girl?" he half shouted at her. "He is gone. I know that. Your sister knows that. Even your girlfriend knows that." Ruby looked at Blake, but the girl only looked away. "All you're doing is prolonging his suffering." Ruby felt her hand slack against her scythe. She didn't want that. She didn't want Prince to suffer. But he was still alive. She knew he was. Saber had said it himself. "Beans!" Prince called out, his voice weak. No, Ruby thought and shook her head. A life was a life, no matter its condition. And she had sworn to protect all of them. "I am doing what I swore to do," she countered, a tear falling down her cheek. "I won't move." "Then I will move you myself." Saber snarled and began to move forward. "Stand down." It wasn't a shout, but Gyra's voice boomed through the area. "The both of you." He stepped down from the porch, his heavy boots splashing mud around him and disturbing the petals and causing them to turn to smoke. Striding over, he put a hand on his guard's shoulder and gave him a stern look. "We are not killers, Saber," he said in a much softer tone. "If there is a chance he can survive, then it is our responsibility to give him that chance." Gyra siding with her should have given her more confidence, but it didn't. If anything, it only gave her new doubts about her actions. She'd seen firsthand the damage his passiveness could do and how his inaction had left Blake haunted for life. "But sir—" "No buts," Gyra commanded. "You are a huntsman, not an executioner. We will handle the Grimm once it leaves Mr. Protodio." With a disgruntled sigh and a dirty look in her direction, the man lowered his gun and moved away to pick up his sword. He didn't holster it though, merely extending it into the Naginata form and held it at the ready. "Aura's up," he ordered, a dark brown light shimmering around him. "Weapons ready." Meeting Gyra's eye, the chieftain gave her a small nod of acknowledgement before moving out of the way. Though the renewed doubts were still racking around in her head, she at least felt reassured knowing that the guards were no longer going to try and kill Prince the second she turned her back. One by one, everyone in the area activated their aura. A myriad of colors lit up the dark garden and cast warm glow over everything. The only person who didn't activate their aura, however, was Petal. RWBY wasn't even sure that the girl knew how to activate it, so as she stepped next to Weiss and prepared to fight whatever came out of the boy, she turned to her girlfriend and pointed to the crying girl. "Protect Petal," she instructed her, gaining a nod in return. Watching the girl move over to guard the child, RWBY extended her side and turned her gaze to the boy that had been so playful less than 10 minutes ago. They didn't have to wait long, less than a full minute, but it felt like hours. Hours of watching the boy writhe and squirm in his attempt to get himself free of Weiss' glyph. It was pointless though. While he might have had the strength to free himself a few minutes ago, that strength was clearly gone. All he could do was drag the wet, sticky mud around and call out his sister's name. "B-dash," he choked, unable to finish the word. Feeling more tears fall down her cheek, she took a shaky breath and pulled the bolt back. And then it happened. With one last incoherent groan, the man's head fell into the mud with a sickening squelch. Nobody breathed, or even moved, nobody except Petal, who had begun to struggle against Blake's grip in an attempt to get to her brother. That quickly came to a stop though as black smoke began to rise from his back. It was slow, and almost like the usual smoke that Grimm turned into when they died, but instead of evaporating, it gathered into a small ball that hovered off the ground, menacingly bobbing up and down. 2 red orbs the size of marbles blinked to life within it, and RWBY felt the familiar sensation of being watched wash over her as the area grew cold. "Fire!" Saber called. The guard opened fire at the creature, the flash of their shots lighting up the sky as the dust was discharged. However, their hopes quickly vanished. The dust did nothing but glide through it as the red orbs danced out of the way of the incoming projectiles. It was too agile and too small a target to hit. Realizing bullets wouldn't work, RWBY rushed forward and lashed out with her scythe. Just like with the bullets, the orbs moved apart and allowed the blade to slip between them. She tried again and again, but it didn't work. Growing desperate, she thrust a hand into the smoke in an attempt to grab the orb, but immediately regretted it. It felt like her hand had been thrust into an ice bath, and the sensation quickly tore through her body and forced her to her knees beside Prince. Shivering, she wrapped her arms around herself and dropped her weapon, unable to do anything as she watched the Grimm begin to drift away towards Petal. "No," she stuttered, struggling to take a breath. She couldn't stop it. There was nothing to stop. It had no body, and even touching it was enough to incapacitate her through her aura. She'd made a mistake, the very one Crow had warned her about, and her failure had only left others in danger. If she couldn't kill it, how was Blake going to stop it from taking Petal? Turning towards the aforementioned pair, she watched in surprise as Blake stood her ground. Not even flinching as the ball of gas approached her, she hooked an arm under Petal's struggling shoulder and dragged her up. The girl looked awful. While none of them looked fatal, deep cuts covered her face and arms. Blood flowed freely from most of them, matting her long ginger hair and causing her to be as pale as her brother. Blake's amber eyes closed for a second, and RWBY saw the girl take a deep breath. Once they opened again, they were filled with a steely resolve, and she raised her sword to Petal's throat. The Grimm paused to survey her, its red orbs drifting lazily to avoid a bullet that was fired from a guard's gun. "Do it and she dies," Blake said, her voice void of any emotion. RWBY knew Blake. She'd spent nearly a whole year growing closer and learning more about her. Every new thing she learned had only shown her just how good of a person she was, and only made her fall deeper in love with her. However, if anyone asked her if she could say with absolute certainty that what Blake had just said was a bluff, she knew the answer would have been no. The emotionless visage, the cold and heartless tone of her voice, the hard, unflinching amber eyes, the ease in which it came to her, it was clear that it was not the first time she had looked such a way. Unfortunately, the Grimm didn't get the same impression, and slowly began to inch forward. In response, Blake twisted the blade, its razor-sharp edge drawing blood and making the girl gasp in pain and squirm even more. The Grimm paused again, little more than a meter away from them. The two orbs stopped their dancing and surveyed the pair. Clearly it was beginning to take her seriously. "Yong now!" The blonde emerged from behind her partner, her eyes a deeper scarlet than RWBY had ever seen them. Stepping forward, she cocked her fist backward as her hair ignited, sending flames licking up arm before thrusting it forward towards the Grimm. A shot rang through the air, and Yang's hand burst into flames, flames that rained down in front of her and blanketed the ball of smoke. "How's that taste, asshole?" the girl spat, the sound of cracking greeting everyone's ears. As the Grim emerged from the billowing flames, Ruby saw that there was only one orb left. The smoke ball that surrounded it also seemed thinner and smaller, and as Yang reared her fist back again to finish it, the chill backed off and began to retreat towards the treeline. Unfortunately, while the guards fired off a few more shots, it disappeared from sight seconds later, and Saber swore in frustration. "Callie," Gyra said quietly, walking back over to Saber, who had already begun to pace angrily back and forth. "Check on the boy." Turning back to look at Prince, Ruby was met by his green eyes staring blankly at her. There was nothing there. No life, no soul. Nothing. She didn't even need to wait for Callie to arrive and check him to know the truth. Her entire life, she had been preparing herself for death, understanding that it would be an inevitability in the line of work she wished to go into. But seeing it in person was something else entirely. It took all of her energy to not throw up. "Rubes," she heard her sister's voice say in her ear as a pair of warm arms wrapped around her. "Come on. We've got to get ready to go." With great difficulty, she pulled her eyes away from Prince's lifeless form and allowed her sister to pull her to her feet and forced herself even closer to the heat that was folding off of the woman. As Yang held her close, Ruby looked around the garden and saw Blake still standing where she had been holding Petaley, her hands shaking as she looked at the girl's blood on her blade. Her eyes were no longer cold and unflinching, but filled with tears and regret. "Blake?" Ruby heard Weiss say. The heiress walked over and gently pried the weapon from the Fauna's hands and dropped it to the floor. "It's okay." "What did I do?" she muttered, knowing that was her fault too. Not only had she allowed the Grim to escape, she'd forced her friend to relive and become something she hated. After all the effort the girl had honed through just to get to the point where she could begin to forgive herself and stop blaming herself, Ruby had thrust those memories and feelings back onto her. She'd done that. To the girl she loved. "Don't worry, Abu Dash. You helped it get away." Saber's voice was angry as he stepped away from Gyra despite the taller man's attempts to stop him. "Fuck off," Yang spat in response. "Had she let me do what needed to be done, that thing wouldn't still be out there," Saber replied and stepped towards Yang. "She defended it, she stopped us from doing our job, and now anyone that thing kills is on her. I'm right and you know it. But you don't get to talk to her that way," Yang growled, her eyes turning red and her hair beginning to glow dangerously. "Now get the fuck out of my way." Ruby definitely didn't miss the fact that Yang hadn't disagreed with him. "You think your attitude hasn't been a hindrance to this mission too?" Saber snapped, showing no sign of fear at Yang's rising anger. "From the moment we left the village you have been full of anger and resentment because we didn't have the time to stay and help them, and all that has done is brought more Grim to us. Saber, He shrugged Gyra's arm away from his shoulder. "Not to mention bringing a Schnee into our fold and setting the entire guard on edge." "Now that's too far," Gyra said, stepping in front of the man. "The Schnee girl has been nothing but good to us. We cannot hold such prejudices, or we are not better than those who treat us in such a manner." "How can I not?" the man roared at his chieftain. "We were attacked. You? The leader of our people. And yet when I called for help, they sent no adults, nobody who understood the necessities of being a hunter. Instead, they sent children. Just like every time we ask for aid, we are sent the bar dash. You've gotten more help from the council than any town out here gets." Yang spat back at him. "That is enough." There was no malice in the words. No anger or frustration. Instead, they were calm and considerate. But it was likely for that reason that everybody stopped and turned to look at Callie. The small woman knelt beside Prince, folding his arms over his chest and closing his eyes. "It is disrespectful to argue in the presence of the dead." "No." It was barely a whisper, but Petaley's voice felt like a knife to Ruby's heart. "I understand you are angry, Saber," Callie continued, pushing herself to her feet and walking over to the man. "And we shall hear your concerns once." "No." "We are safe, but that time is not now. The Grim will be here soon, so we must move." He was cut off as an orange blur flew past him. Skidding to her knees at her brother's side, she slowly began to shake his lifeless body as tears dripped from her face. "Prince?" she cried, her bloody fingers clutching the torn shirt for dear life as he continued what could have easily passed as a deep sleep. "Pete, please wake up!" The urge to throw up was growing stronger, and Ruby knew that if she didn't look away then it was going to overtake her. "I will have us ready in 5 minutes, Chiefess." Saver nodded. "Good," the woman said, turning back to Prince's body and kneeling beside the crying child. Giving them one last annoyed look, the man took off towards the guard and began to issue instructions. "Fucking asshole," Jan growled, pulling her towards the cabin steps where Weiss was comforting Blake. "Come on, Rubes." Allowing herself to be pulled past Blake's dad and towards the steps, she took one last look at the scene behind her. What had been a peaceful garden only minutes ago looked unrecognizable. The lush green had been replaced with a sea of red smoke as her petals began to disintegrate. Guards rushed around getting everything back into the cart, and in the center of it all was a girl crying over the corpse of the only family she had left. "And it's all my fault." Chapter 62, Overwhelming Odds. "I've got you," Ruby breathed, leaning down to pick up somebody she couldn't make out. "Keep going." Spitting around, she lashed out with her scythe, its sharp blade tearing clean though a Beowulf that had leapt at her. Unable to see much in the inky blackness, she extended her aura as far as she could to make sure nobody was behind her. Sensing nobody else, she turned on her heel and followed the flashlights ahead of her. Growing up on Patch, she'd heard many horrific sounds in her life. It hadn't been that uncommon to hear vicious growls and haunting howls drifting through the windows, nor had it been rare to hear the occasional scream as someone happened across the source. As such, Ruby thought that she would be prepared for the sounds of battle that would no doubt be the soundtrack of her near future. If only she'd known just how wrong she was. Those howls, those screams, they were nothing. The growls and snarls were no longer barred by walls, instead nipping at their heels in an attempt to bring down anyone they could. The dark road around her was filled with the screams of the people unfortunate enough to be dragged down by the grim, and with no distance between herself and the gore as there was back home, the sound stuck in her head far longer than it did in the air. Callie had been right. It had barely been a minute after Prince's death that the first pack of Beowulfs had shown up, and only a few more before the entire clearing had been swarmed. Nevermores and griffins had descended from the sky, creeps and sentinels had burrowed up from the ground, and all manner of other grim had surrounded them on all sides. It had taken almost 10 minutes to clear a path to the road, and 3 guards had been snatched in the process, but with no other choice, the decision had been made to run straight to Secure. Thankfully, it wasn't much further. They could already see the lights in the distance, and having already crossed the border of the dead zone, a call to the village had already been made, so Ruby knew that the defenses were being readied. All they needed to do was get there. Unfortunately, with a horde on their tail, that was easier said than done, especially given how tired she was. Her body had still yet to even recover from her interaction with the chill. There was still a general feeling of unease and numbness to her body, so much so that every swing of her scythe made her feel that it was slipping from her grip. However, even worse was the guilt. Her mind was still racing, and she knew the memory of Petley crying over her brother's corpse would be etched into her brain forever, as was the memory of what her actions had forced Blake to do. But before she could even process and come to terms with any of it, she'd been forced to bury it and focus on the mission. To do anything else would cause even more lives to be lost. Lifting her sniper, she took out a griffin that had dived at the group. That was one thing to be thankful for, at least. Though she was unable to see any members of the group for more than a second, the dark fur and scales of the grim stood out rather prominently against the darkness. While it was nowhere near as easy to track them as it was in the daytime, their silhouettes and gleaming red at least made it so that they weren't impossible to see. Slicing through a few more, she finally caught up with the group and found herself next to a familiar-feeling aura. "Wise," she panted. "We need to see what's back there." "On it," the girl huffed. A large glyph formed in front of them, and out of it burst Wise giant Queen Lancer, its bright white light covering the entire crowd of people. In the split second that it hovered over them, Ruby was given the first clear look at their group since they had left the cabin. Gyra and Yang were up front, the former pulling the cart in which Petley, Dottie, and her grandson sat inside of, as well as Prince's body. Blake, Ilya, and Saber ran alongside them, defending them from whatever grim came their way and using their night vision to keep everyone on the road. Callie brought up the rear and led the other civilians, while the quickly thinning guard tried their best to surround and protect them. The light only lasted a second, however, and the Queen Lancer immediately took off towards the horde of red eyes that were behind them. Unfortunately, as it reached them and illuminated the grim, Ruby felt a pit in the bottom of her stomach. There were far more than she had thought. Beowulfs, Borbatusks, creeps, howlers, berserkers, deathstalkers, and many more that she couldn't make out. In their attempts to reach the group, they all crawled over and knocked each other aside, the constant rippling of the horde looking more like a wave of tar than anything resembling animals. The second the Lancer reached the horde, it was swallowed, and the light was extinguished. Well, not good, Ruby breathed, knowing that there was no way they could take on so many grim. We have to slow them down. On it! Another glyph was produced, and Allie the Beowulf emerged at Weiss' side. I need a base. Got it. As Weiss hopped up onto the summon, Ruby activating her semblance and Petal burst ahead to the cart. Averting her eyes away from Prince's covered body, she grabbed a tube of water dust. All of it? She called to her partner. Yes. Hurling the vial backwards, she raised her weapon and switched her scope to night vision mode. Finding the canister, she fired off a round and caused the container to rupture. Blue dust glittered across the sky for a second before erupting into a large wall of water. As it rushed towards the ground and sprayed them with a mist, large glyphs appeared along it, and the entire thing quickly began to freeze over. While plenty of grim managed to avoid it, the sickening sound of flesh hitting the hard ice filled the air, and Ruby knew that they had at least succeeded in buying themselves a few minutes. Taking one last glance at Petali, who was huddled up in her brother's cloak, Ruby jumped down from the cart and rejoined her partner in defending the convoy. Ruby was not prepared for the bright lights that greeted her as she burst through the treeline and into the clearing. Covering her eyes from the floodlight, she looked up at the 20-feet wall and felt a large sense of relief rush through her. They had made it. She'd never been so happy to see a wall before, but before she could take a moment to appreciate it, a male voice boomed over them, filling the clearing and causing the leaves on the surrounding trees to shake. Get down! Dropping to the floor, Ruby saw 20 tiny lights flare to life ahead of her from holes in the wall. Fire! Flashes of blue, red, and yellow lit up the wall as the turrets within fired into the trees. Looking over her shoulder, she saw the gleaming red eyes blink out of existence one by one until there was nothing left but darkness. Power down! The voice shouted again. No! Pushing herself up to her feet, she sprinted over to the wall and quickly found the source of the voice inside a small bunker beside the gate. Don't power down! There's more! A lot more! The man surveyed her through his monocle, which was flitting back and forth between different images of the clearing, and gave a short nod. Engage the rotary field and raise the southern gate, he said hurriedly into his scroll before turning back to her. Escort your people inside. Have you any fighters? Your aid defending the wall would be appreciated. Hearing a loud buzzing to her left as the thick metal gate began to rise, she ran back over to the group and began to usher them towards safety. As she did, she saw small posts lift from the ground on the edge of the forest, and a thin pale blue light began to run from one post to another. Recognizing it as hard light, she watched a Beowulf try to run through it, only for its paws to be sliced off. As it skidded to a stop, Ilya lashed out with her whip and shoved the tip through its eye. Yong? She called, running over to her sister. Get THARG. She only managed to make it halfway before a fully grown Nevermore slammed down next to the blonde and unfolded its wings with an ear-piercing caw. The force of the impact blew everyone nearby off their feet, and the contents of the cart were scattered across the area as the truck bed rolled over. The beast itself was almost as tall as the village's wall, and a thick plate of white armor covered its face. Ruby! She heard Weiss shout worriedly as she corrected herself. The crystal! Huh? Shaking her head and looking over at the wreckage, she saw the dust canisters rolling along the ground. While most of them looked fine, one of them was starting to emit a yellow glow from the small window on the side. That was definitely not a good sign. I got it, Ruby replied and tried to grab the vial. Unfortunately, just as she reached out for it, large feathers slammed into the ground in front of her, and she was forced to jump backwards as more flew past her ear and slammed into the wall. Another shriek left the oversized bird as it moved to stand over the vial. A whirring filled the air and the turrets turned on it and opened fire, but the thick feathers merely repelled them. "Yang!" Ruby called, getting the attention of her sister, who tossed aside a feather that had almost struck Dottie in the chest. "Me, and you are on the Nevermore. Weiss, Blake, you two focus on getting everyone inside the village." "Got it," both Weiss and Blake replied, rushing to help pick up the people who had fallen from the cart. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that the Grimm had wisened up to the hard light tripwire and had begun to jump over it, but even as they did, the Faunus guard and fighters from the village engaged them. So, with the smaller Grimm being handled, she prepared herself to take on the larger one. "What's the plan, Rubes?" Yang asked, throwing the giant feather in her hand at the large avian, only for it to glance off the faceplate. "Keep it distracted." On her order, Yang reared her fist back and fired off an explosive shot, striking the hard armor of the Nevermore and creating a black cloud. With its sight obscured, Ruby ran to the side and climbed onto its wings. With a swing of her scythe, she cut through the bird's flight feathers. A shriek of pain left it, but as its head turned to face her, Yang fired off another shot, and its head swung back to slam its sharp beak into the ground where the girl had been standing only seconds ago. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Ruby dashed over to the other wing and clipped those feathers too. With another loud shriek, the bird began to flap its wings. Despite it not doing anything to help it fly, the action itself was still powerful enough that Ruby's feet were swept out from underneath her. As she fell to the ground, a powerful wing clipped her shoulder and sent her crashing into the dirt, where she felt her aura flicker. After hours spent running and fighting and using her semblance, she knew there wasn't much left. "You Oka Dash." "I'm fine," Ruby grumbled into her earpiece and pushed herself to her feet. "It's grounded, I just need an opening." "Rear up into guillotine?" "Sounds G-dash." Ruby was cut off as the bird let out another loud shriek that rattled her bones. Clearly realizing that it could no longer fly, it began to lash out at Yang with its clawed wings. Trusting the girl to handle it, Ruby replaced her magazine with a gravity dust one and got in position while Yang smacked the claws and beak aside. After a couple of seconds though, instead of dodging a strike, Yang's hand came out to meet it. Her hair glowing gold, and Ruby felt the impact blow through her own as the woman caught the claw, twisting her body to stretch the wing out as far as possible. With the wing extended and the hard feathers parted, Ruby saw a straight path to the soft flesh beneath and shot towards it, shearing through the wing and causing the avian to rear up and let out a cry of pain. "Now!" Ruby called as she landed. Springing into a backflip, Ruby lodged her feet between Crescent Rose's fangs and shaft. Feeling the nuzzle meet something metal, she looked back and saw Yang's fist pressed against it, the arms pulling back until the back of the blade rested against her chest. Once again, her hair shone like the sun and she lashed out. Her arm shot forward, and there was a loud bang as Ember Celica shot off around. The world turned into nothing but a blur of color. Blacks, greens, reds, and whites all rushed past her, all blending together as she shot towards the Nevermore. With each pull of her trigger, the colors merged more, and finally everything came to a stop. The blade made contact with the Corbian's neck, and though the hard feathers gave some resistance, one last gravity round proved too much for them to handle. Hearing the ring of metal in the air, as Crescent Rose slipped free on the other side of the bird's neck, Ruby activated her semblance and rushed towards the ground. Grabbing the lightning crystal, she dodged out of the way just in time as the heavy body slumped to the floor and began to disintegrate. Looking over the canister, she was thankful to see that there was no breach, and while the crystal was emitting more light than it had previously, it still seemed to be safe as it could be at least. Slipping the canister into her back pouch, she turned around and sniped a Beowulf that had jumped at Gyra from behind. "I've got the crystal," she relayed to her team. "Is everyone inside?" "Everyone except Mrs. Fern," Blake replied. "But we can't find her anywhere." "She was taken before we got here," Saber replied, his words causing Ruby's stomach to churn. "The civilians are safe. Just focus on defending the wall." Though she hated to admit it, Ruby knew the man was right. She wished she could go and search for the missing woman, maybe even bring her back if she could, but she knew that was impossible. She had no idea how long it had been since she was taken, or what had even taken her. Not to mention that the last time she'd gone against Saber's orders, she'd only made the situation worse. So, deciding it was better to obey orders for once rather than give them, she loaded a new magazine and prepared to hold off the oncoming horde. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done. With every Grimm that was felled, 3 more would arrive, and as the bodies began to stack up, it was becoming rather difficult to find her footing. Worse still was that the field was beginning to grow dark with the smoke that their bodies generated. Even with the floodlights bearing down on them, it was getting harder and harder to see again as the mist surrounded them. More and more she found herself relying on the specks of red to see her targets, but that only told her their location. As such, when an armor-clad berserker appeared out of the smoke, RWBY was completely unprepared and failed to dodge the heavy fist that slammed into her stomach. Feeling her breath leave her, she was thrown across the clearing and landed face first on the ground. Spitting out a mouthful of mud and watching the red eyes make a beeline towards the wall, she coughed and raised a hand to her ear. "Wise," she coughed. "Berserker headed for the gate." "I've got it," she called. A pair of gleaming blue orbs emerged in front of the red ones, and a loud sickening crunch reached her ears. As the force of the impact blew the smoke away, RWBY saw that Weiss had summoned a berserker of her own, and it quickly began to trade blows with its darker brother. "You okay?" she heard over the turret fire, feeling a hand closing around her arm and pulling her to her feet. Looking up, she saw Blake's amber eyes shining in the darkness. "Yeah," she groaned. "There's 2-man dash." She only just saw the bright yellow stinger in time. Pushing her girlfriend out of the way, they both tumbled to the ground and found themselves looking up at a giant deathstalker. Smaller deathstalkers crawled from its back, roughly 20 in number, and each as tall as an adult human. Thankfully, they had less armor than the adult and were easier to kill, but even as she and Blake tore them apart, RWBY knew it was pointless. Another deathstalker had already emerged from the trees, along with more berserkers and all manner of other Grimm. Creeps burst from the ground, scattering the hard light projectors across the field. Nevermore shrieks filled the sky as more of the giant birds joined the fray, and more griffins than she could count were repeatedly dive-bombing the fighters. "There's too many," RWBY breathed, finding herself pushed back towards the wall as more Grimm emerged from the forest. "We can't hold them all off." "Well, the walls won't hold without us," Yang replied. "Then what do we do?" Blake asked, transforming her katana into a sickle and whipping it around her. 2 baby deathstalkers fell dead, only to be replaced with 3 more. RWBY felt her back collide with the wall, and something hard pressed into her. Her eyes flew open. "I have an idea." Weiss let out a groan, just as she always did when RWBY claimed to have an idea, only that time RWBY knew the girl was right to be concerned. Digging into her back pouch, she pulled out the canister holding the lightning crystal and looked through the small window. The power held inside the tube was definitely enough to clear a majority of the horde, but what else would be caught in the blast? How much destruction would it cause? "Weiss," she said cautiously as Blake moved in front to protect her. "How powerful is this crystal right now?" "You can't be serious, RWBY." "What other choice do we have?" RWBY fired back at her sister, receiving no reply. "Weiss." A sigh came through the earpiece. "Anything within 20 meters will be fried from the heat of the rupturing alone, but the lightning will reach for miles. So we just need to get it into the forest." "And the forest F-dash." "For crying out loud!" Saber's voice cut through them, his edge of annoyance back as he grunted from fighting. "You are huntresses. If you do not act, the village falls regardless. Now stop stalling and do your damn job." RWBY knew he was right. Even with the turret's support, there was no way they could hold off the horde. There were simply too many. A choice had to be made. "He's right," RWBY mumbled, unscrewing the cap. "We have to risk it." "Damn it, RWBY," Yang snapped. "Will you just listen to me for once?" "We're out of time, Yang." RWBY snapped back, gently pulling the crystal free of the canister. Nothing could be left to chance. "I have to do this." "Wah dash." Before Yang could respond, RWBY gripped the dust tightly in her hand and activated her semblance. She needed the crystal as far away from the village as possible. Feeling tears sting her eyes, she rushed towards the Grimm. Ducking under the paws and weaving between legs, she reached the edge of the tree line and hurled the crystal as hard as she could. The small yellow gem glinted with a light of its own, and as it flew through the air, Ruby felt a claw slide along her back, but ignored it. Pulling out her sniper, she raised the scope to her eye and lined up the shot. She knew there was no way to escape the blast radius in time, but the shot had to be taken. So with a deep breath, she pulled the trigger as one last thought entered her mind. "I'm sorry, Yang." "Ruby!" Yang felt the scream tear through her throat as Ruby disappeared into a cloud of rose petals and took off towards the Grim. Before the girl even reached them, Yang felt her stomach twist and her heart ache as she knew Ruby had just committed herself too. The girl had just done what Yang had spent her whole life fearing, but surely it couldn't have come so soon. It just couldn't. There was still so much left for her, so much she'd yet to experience. She found a girlfriend, a best friend, both of which still held so many more possibilities for her. "Yang, move!" Her partner's voice was faint, but she felt a shoulder slam into hers and fell backwards. Looking up from her position on the floor, she saw Blake running straight at Weiss with a hard light projector in hand. Not wasting a second, Weiss snatched it from the furnace and ripped out the dust tray. Flipping the cylinder of her rapier open, she haphazardly poured the bright blue powder inside and gave the weapon a twirl. Not even a second later, a deafening explosion erupted in the forest and all chaos broke loose. Lightning and fire spread out before her in equal measure. As a tremendous amount of heat washed over them, thick yellow lines of electricity arced through the air, striking things at random. Trees shattered into splinters and caught fire, canvassing the clearing in red-hot ash. Grim ruptured from the inside out and furled into smoke, their spikes and armor flying off at such a velocity that any of their allies nearby were shredded to pieces. Even the wall behind her ruptured and sprayed concrete over the surrounding as lightning struck the turrets and caused the dust inside of them to explode. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw an arc of electricity connect with the tip of Weiss' rapier, throwing her backward into the heavy metal gate and breaking her aura. Almost immediately, Blake took off after her, but Yang didn't. Instead, she took off in the opposite direction. Running as fast as she could towards the source of the explosion, she punched her way through the few Grim that barely survived and swung her head from side to side. With every second that passed, more and more panic began to set in. There was nothing but destruction and dead Grim everywhere she looked. But she knew Ruby was there somewhere. She'd still had aura, and Weiss had done something. Weiss was smart, the smartest person she knew. Surely she couldn't have F.A. "Ruby!" Yang's thoughts were cut off. A few feet away from her, sticking out from amid a mass of disintegrating Grim, was Crescent Rose. Running towards it, she slid to her knees and hastily pushed the bodies aside. It took 3 unrecognizable Grim until she finally caught a glimpse of red clothing, and 4 more until Ruby was uncovered. She looked terrible. Her clothes were singed and falling away, harsh burns covered her arms, and blood leaked freely from a large cut on her head. "Not a no-no," Yang muttered, feeling tears roll down her face. "You can't, please, please." Yang's hand shot out, quickly finding the girl's neck and testing for a pulse. For a second, she felt nothing and her stomach twisted nastily, but then she felt it. A small thrum on the vein. It was weak, very weak, but the fact that it was there made Yang's heart sing with joy. "Thank go dash. Yang Lu dash." She didn't need Blake's warning. She'd already heard it and felt it. Something large was approaching her from behind, but whatever it was, it had chosen the worst possible time to attack. Ruby was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. And there was nothing on Remnant that was going to change that. No Grim, no animal, no person, not even any gods if there were any, were going to touch her so long as Yang was by her side. So standing to her feet, and feeling more heat than even the crystal had produced rushed through her body, she reared back her fist and turned around. "Aarg!" With as much force as her body could allow, she struck out. Powered by the full force of her semblance, her fist crashed into the armor-clad face of a fully grown Deathstalker, shattering it like glass. As it disintegrated, her fist continued unfazed, and she was forced to a knee as the hand struck the ground, ripping it apart and sending stones and splinters from the previous explosion screaming towards every Grim that had been behind the oversized scorpion. Fire from her hair ran down her arm, spreading out and engulfing all in front of her. One by one, they all crumbled to smoke, but Yang felt her aura break. She didn't care. All she cared about was that her sister was safe. So despite her body screaming at her to stop and rest, She turned around and gently picked up her sister's frail form. "You're okay," she muttered shakily, more for herself than anything. "I've got you." Standing to her feet and pushing away the guard that tried to take Ruby from her, she took a deep breath and began the slow trek back to the village gate.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.